For example, if we're trying to charge in Jane's and the Howling Banshees into a unit, but they have something with fights first nearby that could do a heroic intervention, if we move the Farseer Guardian brick within 12 inches of that unit that would be heroically intervening, then we can stop that heroic intervention from happening if they don't have enough CP to do so. What if your army could dictate every engagement, deny your opponent's best plays, and still delete key threats across the board? That is Seer Council. In this video, we're going to be covering a few things that we weren't able to make time for in the first deep dive. We're going to focus on actually playing the game with Seer Council. And so we'll be talking about the pregame, basic deployment strategy, early game tactics, mid and late game tactics, strategic concepts, detachment specific tactics, and then we'll recap at the end. In the pregame, you often are going to be asking your opponent some questions that you would regardless of the detachment that you're taking. With Seer Council, there's a few questions that we're asking for specific reasons, and I just wanted to highlight those real quickly. We're going to be asking our opponent about indirect so that we can get an idea of what we need to leave in reserves, but also some of our units that we're going to prioritize using Psychic Shield on to make sure that our opponent doesn't get their indirect damage on that unit. We're going to talk about infiltrate, of course, but part of that is so that we can make sure we're going to be able to claim some space, and we're going to have that little infiltrate battle that happens at the beginning of the game. And a few key things that you want to make sure you're possibly trying to do, because it doesn't work out on every layout, but if it can, you can often get your infiltrators to where they can either do a reactive move or a scout move and get back into range of a psyker so that you can apply a stratagem on them. For example, your rangers could reactive move, possibly if the opponent moves within 9 inches, of course, or your scorpions could do a scout move to come back within 9 inches of a psyker so that you can apply either Psychic Shield or maybe even Forewarned if they have a aggressive scout move themselves, to try to keep that unit alive so that you can use them in the game in the future. Another consideration with Seer Council specifically is our own scouting. We can still keep our scouts close to psychers. A lot of times we're going to be moving our Corsair Void Reavers up, and we'll have a Warlock Skyrunner nearby that can still apply Psychic Shield or Forewarn on them as well. And so again, we just want to make sure that we are getting the most value out of even our skirmish units, and we can do that and sometimes take the opponent by surprise by protecting our scouts and infiltrators with our stratagems, which can throw off the expectations of our opponent. You're of course going to ask your opponent about deep strike, whether they have 6-inch deep strike or they can deep strike in turn 1 so that you know how to screen. This is a question that you're always going to be asking your opponent regardless of detachment, but with Seer Council, we can generally keep some units back to do some screening throughout the first few turns of the game and do it better than some detachments because we have the ability to Unshrouded Truth them forward later in the game to get them back in the fight. We also have a lot of infantry in Seer Council, generally speaking. There are very few vehicles in most lists, and so our units are pretty fragile, and we really want to make sure our opponent cannot deep strike early in the game and get some major damage on us from the get-go, because that could possibly throw a major wrench in our plans, and if they get into one of our important units, it could spell the end of the game even right off of the bat in turn 1. You're going to ask your opponent about fights first, and the reason this is highlighted is because we often don't bring very many melee units. We're often bringing 1 or maybe 2 squads of Howling Banshees. Often one of those is led by Jane Czar. And we need to really make sure we get good use out of all the tools in our toolbox. And one of the things we do not want to do is send Jane Czar into a fight first unit without knowing exactly where that unit is, the possibilities of heroic intervention. Later on in the video, we're going to be talking about some ways to make it difficult for your opponent to actually take advantage of their fights first as much as they may like due to some of the combinations and units with enhancements that we have in this detachment. You're going to ask them about redeploys much in the same way that you would want to know about their deep strikes and things. We just want to make sure we understand exactly what our opponent's going to be able to do, where they're going to be able to move units so that we can try to keep ours safe. You want to ask about the units that your opponent has that have the best saves or very good invulnerable saves like a 3-up invuln or 4-up invuln. Also, what might be some of their toughest units, things that have 12 toughness, for example. And again, you're going to want to know this in general, no matter your detachment, but specifically for Seer Council, it gives us some priority targets for Isha's Fury. And these are often going to obviously overlap with what you're going to want to use your grenade strats on and your swooping hawks. But because we have another way of applying mortal wounds with Isha's Fury, we really want to make sure we know the priority targets that we're sending mortal wounds into. Okay, deployment. So deployment is a massive topic, and I could spend much more time than I'm going to put into this entire video just talking about deployment, obviously. There's also a lot of generic information I could give you on deployment and using good rules of thumb and strategies for how to deploy with Aeldari. And we're going to cover some of that slightly, but I do want to make this focused on Seer Council. And so I'm going to try to keep most of the ideas behind deployment, what's unique about Seer Council and how to deploy them specifically, so that you understand some of the differences between using Seer Council and, say, Aspect Host or War Host or one of the other detachments. We're going to talk about objective coverage, secondary considerations, screening, board presence, staging, and lastly, protecting key units. Let's hop into TTS and take a look at these ideas and get some visual examples of what they mean. Okay, we're in TTS and I have a Seer Council list that I've already done a generic deployment with, and we're going to cover the bullet points that were in the previous slide and talk about how they relate to Seer Council specifically. In Seer Council, we often take a very infantry-heavy list, so this list here is pretty much all infantry with a few exceptions. We've got the Warwalker, we have Warlock Skyrunners, and in general, you're going to be bringing Warlock Skyrunners in every list. You can see we have our Striking Scorpions up here, ready to scout move into safety into this ruin. We have some Howling Banshees on the other side of them to protect from some possible aggression on this side. The Striking Scorpion should be enough of a block, or at least slow down the scouting units for our opponent so that they don't get easy access into charging our Farseer Guardian Brick, for example, back here. And so on this side, we have the Striking Scorpion slowing, and on this side, we have the Howling Banshees as a threat. So if they try to do charges on this side or scout, advance, and charge, we have a fights first answer sitting on this side. Now, talking specifically about objective coverage, this idea is pretty simple. We just want to make sure we can touch all three objectives. And Seer Council has some great units that are very useful for making sure that happens. Of course, you're going to have your infiltrators, which they can often get to at least one, possibly even two objectives. But our opponent's expansion is sometimes kind of far away. And there's places we can put our Warlock Skyrunners that are pretty safe to where with a token, we can actually move them onto the objective. And that will be a great way to make sure that we don't miss out on some points. For example, if the opponent picks that objective for tempting target. The Corsairs can easily move up in this case, move their 7 inches behind this ruin, be pretty safe. And if our opponent tries to take some long shots, we have our Warlock Skyrunner here that can do Psychic Shield, for example. You can move a Scorpion further back and basically just check it. So we'll put a 9-inch on this Warlock, for example, and basically make sure we can get at least one here so that we can use stratagems on them. And then we'll move them the 7 inches. And so we might have to do something more like this to make sure that we can apply our stratagems to the Scorpions. So that would be one example of trying to make sure we have stratagem support for our infiltrators. That might be something and a way to kind of measure it out so that you know exactly where to put these Scorpions in the case that you go second. But at this point, we're able to get on this objective with the Scorpions, of course, but also we can move these Void Reavers and scout them into this staging area that's pretty safe. That will give them access to the center and our natural expansion. The Warlock Skyrunner can go here or even kind of where this Warp Spider Exarch is and still be able to make a normal move and get on the objective. So it's great for doing cleanse or, again, just being the unit if you don't want to expose your Corsair Void Reavers or your Scorpions or doing something else like being aggressive. We have the option to move the Skyrunner onto this objective and still score our secondaries. And that basically brings us into secondary considerations. So We have a lot of units, as you can see, that can touch each objective. So we got our objective coverage taken care of. We also just want to make sure with secondaries that we can just score every secondary. And usually if you have good objective coverage, you're also going to have good secondary consideration. The other point to that as well is making sure we're keeping some units safe from our opponent. For example, our Guardian Bricks are back far enough in safe places to where the opponent's not going to be able to get called a horde. We can scout our Warwalker behind the ruins here to make sure they can't bring it down. So you're going to consider not only your own secondaries, but make it difficult for your opponents. And in Seer Council, we can do that with Psychic Shield. It gives us a little bit of a benefit and a way to try to make sure our opponent can't score some of those important secondaries. And so there isn't too much that's incredibly significant about how to deploy Seer Council over Aspect Host when it comes to objective coverage and secondaries. A lot of these concepts you're going to be using with the other detachments, but it's really just the Skyrunners being fast, and we're going to usually be bringing 2 or 3 of them. That helps us with our objective coverage, and also just the consideration of how to get our scouts or infiltrators within range of a Psyker so that we can still use our stratagems on those units. And that's the main differences of things that you want to consider with deploying Seer Council when it comes to the objectives and secondaries. Now, screening is vitally important with Seer Council. We have a lot of units that cannot afford to get attacked by your opponent's melee and good shooting. So even from deployment, we want to make sure we have things in place that are going to be ready to go forward, like our Warlock Skyrunners ready to go forward. Our Void Reavers can move forward, striking Scorpions, obviously. These Void Reavers as well, this Warlock Skyrunner. And basically just make sure that if we have a unit where these Void Reavers are, for example, if they're a priority unit we want to keep safe, we can move this Skyrunner up and really make it hard for our opponent to do anything to these Void Reavers, because if we put a 9-inch bubble on here, now if our opponent rapid ingresses and they make a 6-inch move, they're going to have to figure out how to get around our Warlock Skyrunner to try to charge, and it's going to be a very long charge. You can even move the Skyrunner over just enough so that the opponent cannot fit between the Skyrunner and the edge of the board, so that they have to go around this side, which will just further make it difficult for the opponent to rapid ingress something and then get it into our priority targets that we're trying to protect, whether that's Lycus or the Howling Banshees, whatever it might be. We just want to make sure that we have some of our cheap units forward to do a good screen, and that's something you want to consider even from deployment, as I mentioned. And so we'll put the Warlock Skyrunner back there. And we also have Warp Spiders. Now, Warp Spiders give us all sorts of options. In a place like this, they can cover all 3 objectives. We can actually touch all 3 with a Flicker Jump. And we can also use them for screening if we need to. And they're often going to be the units that I use to screen later in the game, because they're a little more expensive, but they're also faster. And sometimes the Void Reavers can't quite get to a place that they need to be to actually pull off the screen, or they may have died and they don't have enough models left to actually screen out as effectively as the Warp Spiders. And so make sure you also bring something like Warp Spiders or another unit of Swooping Hawks, or something that's just really fast and can get up front to do some screening for you later in the game when your opponent takes out some of your skirmishing units. When it comes to board presence, that is another major topic that we could spend a lot of time on. But the main point that I want to highlight here is that we are putting units in places where they're still capable of attacking our opponent, and they're actually applying their presence to the board. In the first turn, if we have the Howling Banshees move up into this corner, Chainzar is able to attack this objective, attack the center objective, and it's going to be a little bit further of a charge, but with her auto advance and 2-inch token, we're getting all the way out here, which means possibly a short enough charge to get into our opponent, depending on where they're sitting on our natural expansion. And so she's applying her threat in a large area of the board. Our Warp Spiders are doing the same. If we move forward with our Void Reavers and do something with our Scorpions, let's say for this example here, and now we've moved Lycus, she can advance and get into this position up here Let's say we make like a 2-inch advance with our battle focus token, gets us right up in there. And Lycus is now staged to apply threat across a massive portion of the board. We can obviously attack every objective. We can even get an attack into our opponent's home objective with Lycus from this staged position. And so we are very safe, generally speaking. And of course, you could try to put some screens and move blocks and do whatever you need to do to make sure that the warp spiders here are safe. But if they are safe and in this position, our opponent will have difficulty interacting with them, but they're applying their board presence. They are hidden, but still capable. And I think that's just such a key idea with Seer Council. We bring a lot of very fast, aggressive units, and we need to make sure we're taking advantage of their speed and trying to keep them as safe as possible. But you never want to just leave Lycus sitting back here, because she'll never end up being able to do anything, and her board presence is really limited to the center objective and our natural expansion, whereas you might as well have put her more on this side if you wanted her to be able to actually get to all the objectives. But the reason she would be started over here, for example, would be to get into this staging position. Now, of course, you could move some things around here and put her around where this Warwalker is, and that would be fine too, because that would kind of give you a little bit of the best of both worlds, where she can attack from the beginning, and then she can also stage pretty easily. So there's all sorts of different ways to deploy and things to consider, but I just wanted to show you a generic example that can work. But when you do something like put Lycus back here, you do need to think about where she's going to stage to be able to do her attack on your opponent's home objective, or wherever on the board you're going to need her effectively. And that brings us to staging, which is another bullet point, but really it's applying some of the ideas of board presence and just talking about specific places to put units so that they are staged to attack the opponent. So for example, the Howling Banshees also like to be inside this little triangle area here, because when you tuck them in here like this, they tend to be very safe from both shooting, and of course they have fights first, and so it can be difficult for your opponent to deal with the Banshees, and their threat range is so massive that it's hard for the opponent to really try to dictate where those Howling Banshees are going. And Eldar in general, we always want to try to make sure we are dictating the terms of the fight, and the fight's happening on our terms, and the things that are fighting each other are also what we have wanted to happen. And the way we do that is with our speed, with good board presence, good staging, and making sure that we're actually putting units in places that are threatening but still safe. Makes it very difficult for the opponent to figure out exactly what to do with their own units so that they aren't taken advantage of in the later turns. And lastly, we need to make sure we're protecting key units. So when we had the Howling Banshees over here, she's protecting a lot of key units that could get charged from our opponent, for example. We have our Striking Scorpions that were kind of holding scout moves at bay by being aligned here to kind of protect some of our key units back behind this ruin. And in general, we just want to make sure that once we know what units that are going to be most effective into our opponent's army, we're going to protect them, whether it's by creating good space, by move blocking, screening, or all of the above. And with Seer Council, we're often bringing a big toolkit that has units that are good into very specific types of units. And we need to make sure that we're protecting our units that are most efficient into the things that our opponent have brought the most of, generally speaking. There's always going to be some exceptions to the rule, but a lot of times if your opponent is bringing a whole lot of light infantry, you're going to be really taking care of your warp spiders, your swooping hawks, and the warlocks have destructors, of course, are going to do a lot of damage. And so we need to make sure that those things are being taken care of and have a sense of priority when it comes to keeping them safe. If the opponent has lots of vehicles, of course, our swooping hawks can still do mortal wounds. Our fire dragons are going to be absolute priority, of course. Janezar might be able to do some damage, especially if one of them is a character. And Lycus also could be very important in some instances because of the critical hits on 5-ups that she can help boost the swooping hawk's damage. And so there's all sorts of different things to consider depending on the opponent, and that will change the units that we have that are priority to keep safe. Now, generally speaking, Janezar and the Banshees, Fuegan and the Fire Dragons, and Lycus and the Spiders are going to be good into any faction and any army list. Those are almost always going to be some of the priority units we need to keep safe. So I hope that all makes sense and that all those ideas and the bullet points kind of come together to make it easy to try to make decisions on how you want to deploy. We're going to be putting our units in places that can reach the objectives. Our threat is going to be applied onto the no man's land objectives, and we're going to be able to stage correctly. We want to be able to have our board presence known so our opponent can't just push us off the board. We want to make sure that we're protecting our units and we're doing a good job with setting up our later turns for doing good screening, etc. So it's a lot. Again, I could go really deep into this topic, but I want to make sure we're staying focused with Seer Council, and I want to make sure this video doesn't get crazy long. So I hope that helps, and let's move on to the next slide. Hey guys, real quick, I just wanted to mention that we are approaching 1,000 subscribers, and that's super exciting. Thank you guys so much for your support and everything that you've done as far as feedback and just letting me know what's been helpful in these videos. I really look forward to making more videos, and I would love to see some of the viewers that we have turn into subscribers, and I will do my best to continue making content that's valuable and hopefully helps people go from being casual players or new players to becoming more and more competitive, and the competitive players continuing to grow and advance, become better Aeldari players, so we can start seeing some more Eldar at those top tables. If that's the case and you felt like you've gotten value, I would greatly appreciate a like, subscribe, and bell. That not only helps me, but then we'll let you know when we come out with more videos. And if you want to support further, I have links for Patreon, and of course I do coaching. And so if you want more information on that, check it out in the description, send me an email, and we'll talk about it and get a custom coaching session set up for you. All right, and now back to the slides. The early game. Early game is very important with Seer Council because we tend to have limited ability to send deep striking units into our opponent outside of Lycus, and to a certain degree our Hawks and Jane Czar. Those units can go into our opponent's lines pretty far with their incredible mobility and movement, but if we do that without support or also sending more units to be able to attack our opponent, then we're pretty much sending them to their death, and we're probably not going to be getting the value out of those units because most of the time we're not doing enough damage with our units to actually get their value in one turn. And so a lot of our units, especially the important ones like Lycus and Jane Czar and the Swooping Hawks, to get full value, we often need a couple activations with them, usually at least 2, to get the damage done that they need to get done. Now, there's always, again, exceptions and different things to consider when you're using these units, whether they're also scoring you primaries, other secondaries, move blocking, screening. There's a whole lot to consider for every single movement, but in general, some of the other detachments are able to take a transport and move forward and drop off fire dragons, for example, really close to our opponent. Whereas in Seer Council, we're generally going to be picking up our fire dragons and essentially deep striking them, but if our opponent has done a good job of screening, we're going to struggle to get some of our big damage dealers, namely the fire dragons, into some of our opponent's important units because they've screened well. And so what we have to do is play the early game correctly, where we're fighting our opponent's skirmishing units and bringing their screens down so they don't have the ability to screen for their important units with cheap, weak units. And we want to make sure that we are able to effectively take those screens down so that we can get our fire dragons into their vehicles and monsters. We can get all of our units, such as the Guardian Brick as well, close enough to be able to do maximum damage to our opponent on our go turn. So one of the things with early game is that board control. And yes, I mentioned it in deployment. I'm going to mention it again because it's just that important. We called it board presence, but really board control is taking the idea of board presence, but then actually talking about controlling it in the sense that if your opponent is to step into a certain part of the board, they are in danger from our units. And the board control that we have is generally a mixture of threat and also screening and move blocking. And so if we block our opponent from getting to our objective and we have it screened out, and we have some threats set up that are very fast that can get to the opponent if they begin to enter our zone of control, that is basically the idea of board control. And we want to make sure that we are creating board control with our units. If you let your opponent, and you've probably had this happen to you, whether it's playing against Tyranids or very aggressive factions that can sometimes just kind of send you into your deployment zone and corner you in your own deployment zone, we can't afford to let that happen, because we need the breathing space to really get maximum value from our stratagems and in general our units, and also to score. And so we need to make sure we are gaining board control, and we're going to do that right from the early game by using our infiltrators to kind of claim space, our scouts to back them up, and then having units in threatening positions so that if our opponent tries to take our board control away, we can send in the correct kind of units, whether it's warp spiders or swooping hawks, to get that board control back, and possibly screen and move block so that we can move other units up into better staging positions. So this is all done from the early game. Along the lines of this is pressure without overextending. So with board control, we are getting those threats in position, and when we do that, we're going to cause pressure to be applied to our opponent. We're going to pressure them on their objectives. We're going to pressure the central objective. If they don't do something about our units, they are going to not score, or they're going to just allow us to score too much. We're going to cause them to have to make very difficult decisions, because whether they stay and hide or they come out and get aggressive, both options are going to cause their own sets of problems. Also in the early game, we're going to have to do some objective denial, and that's why Corsair Void Reavers and Warp Spiders and the Warlock Skyrunners can all be very important to try to deny our opponent from scoring a lot of their primary objectives, and sometimes even their secondaries. We are often going to be playing a game where we are staging and applying that board control, but not necessarily scoring way ahead of our opponent necessarily. Every faction and matchup is going to be a little different, so sometimes we will, but sometimes we're not going to be able to. And so we have to make sure we are in position to deny our opponent their objectives as well. This is going to be important, especially in turns 2 and 3, to at least consider. This doesn't mean that you have to just keep throwing units to die onto your opponent's natural expansion, for example. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense, and you just got to let them have their natural expansion, and that's okay. But if they're taking the center, we really need to make sure we can get some OC on the center. We can possibly move block them from getting to the center with some of their bigger units. Whatever it might be, we need to make sure we're doing some objective denial in the early game so that when we take out a big chunk of their army, we can basically come in towards the latter half of the game and score a bunch of points. And we want to make sure our opponent does not get too far ahead of us to where we're not able to score past the difference in score because we just didn't deny them their objectives. Another key consideration with the early game is target priority. Most of the time your opponent's going to have some units that are fast and efficient at dealing with our infantry. If you can make sure to take out those units that are a high priority, they're generally going to be things that have a high volume of attacks, strength 6, decent AP, at least AP 2, and those units are going to be some of the biggest threats, especially if they have good movement or can advance in charge. And from that, you can probably garner some of our biggest weaknesses are against factions that have a lot of those things. That can be some difficult matchups for us. Now, Seer Council does have some answers that some of the other detachments don't have. For example, we can sometimes stage in places that some of the other detachments wouldn't want to because of Psychic Shield, and we have the 18-inch Lone Op. We also have Isha's Fury that can soften the opponent up and kill a few models to make the charge that they do less impactful against some of our units. And on top of that, when they do make the charge, we can use Forewarned to make them -1 to hit, -1 to wound. And all of a sudden, between Isha's Fury and Forewarned, we've really taken the bite off of the melee aggressive factions that are sometimes difficult for us to deal with in some of the other detachments. So, to recap that point, again, make sure you are trying to focus the units that your opponent have that are efficient against us, and we take them out quickly and early so we can be more aggressive in the late game and our opponent can't hit us back as hard. One of the common difficulties that I see in the early game with a lot of the players that I've done coaching with is a lack of value that they're getting out of their units. I've seen a lot of times where players will send their skirmishing units like Striking Scorpions, Corsair Void Reavers, Warlock Skyrunners, sometimes even Warp Spiders or Swooping Hawks, are all kind of those skirmishy type units that are somewhere between 50 and 100 points, where they can do some damage, but they're also able to move, block, and do a lot of different things. If you're not getting at least 3 different points of value out of the unit, then you may need to reconsider what they're doing. Now, if it's really important that they move, block a vehicle, for example, now maybe that's just all they get out of their value. Sometimes it can be that important. So again, there's always rules to be broken. But in general, you're going to want to get at least a good amount of value out of your units, including your skirmishing units. And to give an example of what I mean by that, we could be moving some Corsair Void Reavers onto our opponent's objective to stop them from scoring the primary. And then we're also going to shoot with their weapons, so we're getting a bit of damage, so that's another bit of value. And we're also going to use a Corsair Void Reavers to screen for our other units that are coming up behind them, maybe 9 inches or so behind, and make sure our opponent can't get good value out of a deep strike or a rapid ingress to be able to get into some of our more powerful units than the Corsair Void Reavers. And that would be several points of value that we're getting with the Corsair Void Reavers. Now, what that means is we're possibly scoring a secondary, maybe, such as Storm Hostile Objective. We may be stopping our opponent from scoring their primary. We can be doing some damage, and then we're screening and or move blocking. So that could be 4 or even 5 points of value we're getting just from the Corsair Void Reavers. And all of a sudden, that 60-point unit just got us so much value. Whereas if we just sent some Warp Spiders somewhere on the map to do some screening, and they didn't really have a good target to shoot in, they just shot a vehicle, well, really, they didn't do any damage. And while the screening can be important, a lot of times if that's all they did for 95 points, we didn't get enough value out of the unit to actually make it worthwhile. I hope that makes sense. It's definitely a topic that's a little bit difficult to fully explain. The best way that I can try to get it across is really just that you are getting multiple avenues of value from the unit, namely the ones that I mentioned are going to be the most common. So scoring primary, scoring secondary, denying primary, screening, move blocking, and damage. And so if you can get at least 3 or so of those value propositions out of the unit when you make that move that you're going to make with them, that's often going to be a good sign that you're actually getting good value from the unit. Especially in the early game, we want to try to maximize the value of our units because they have a lot of value in the earliest part of the game, and the value of each unit tends to go down as the game goes on. And so as we get closer to the end of the game, their value goes down and down and down. You would rather have a bunch of points at the end of the game than a bunch of units, whereas in the beginning of the game, you're going to be focused on using your units to do things such as take out your opponent's units so that at the end of the game, we actually have that good score. And so our value for our actual units goes down and down and down, and making sure we're scoring and the importance of scoring continues to go up and up and up. And by the end of the game, we would trade all of our units for more victory points because it's the end of the game and our units don't mean anything. So I hope that kind of puts everything in perspective of what I'm trying to get across here. And these ideas, again, you can apply this to a lot of detachments, but specifically with Seer Council, because of our general game plan to start off cautious, hidden, but capable, but then strike and go very, very aggressive. We need to make sure we're getting value out of each of our units as we set up the turn that we're going to go into our opponent's army. In the mid and late game, Seer Council has to really make sure that we are applying the right amount of aggression versus scoring in each one of the turns. And we have to be able to pivot and be a bit adaptable because we could be very aggressive in the early game and say turn 2 or 3 and take out a lot of our opponent's units. But if we don't switch our mindset to scoring, we may not win the game. And vice versa, if we've been scoring and careful in turns 1, 2, and 3, and our opponent is also still has a lot of their army, we might need to switch to be a bit more aggressive to make sure our opponent can't keep up with scoring against us. And this would be especially true if we're going first. We're possibly going to have to bring the fight to the opponent. We need to make sure that we are adaptable and that we can pivot depending on the game state. In the mid and late game, you're generally going to have to commit your reserves, so you have to bring things in from reserves by turn 3. Now, Seer Council has a bit more flexibility and is generally less punished for committing our reserve units. So if you have fire dragons in reserves, for example, and you bring them down on one of the flanks, they shoot a vehicle. In the other detachments, those fire dragons may not be useful for the rest of the game. They may just be too far away from the rest of the fight. Seer Council, on the other hand, could have a psyker within 9 inches that can then allow them to unshroud truth, and now they could be on the exact opposite side of the board and applying their damage. And so that just gives us the flexibility that if we do have to commit our reserves in a place that isn't necessarily useful that turn, it doesn't mean that we cannot get that unit into the game and into the fight later on because of unshrouded truth. So one nice thing is, don't be quite as concerned if you have to bring something in from reserves that isn't necessarily beneficial on the turn that it came in. We can usually make things happen with our detachment. When it comes to holding objectives under pressure, this is a skill that you have to learn in Seer Council because we do not have the durability natively in our data sheets to hold objectives by just standing on them and letting the opponent shoot at us. We are toughness 3, 1 wound, generally speaking, with 3 or 4 up saves, and generally 5 up invulns. And we're just not able to really take much punishment. It's something that people talk about all the time, is that Aeldari in general has difficulty holding objectives. In the mid and late game, you're going to feel some of the greatest amount of pressure from your opponent on the objectives. And so we have to really focus on using our units and getting the value out of our units by getting on objectives. We're going to focus on protecting our objectives by doing good move blocks and screening so that our opponent cannot shoot or charge into our units that are on the objective. And ideally, we're going to use some of the nice stratagems that Seer Council has, such as Psychic Shield, to make sure that our opponent just can't even interact with our unit that's sitting on an objective. And that's generally how you're going to hold the objective under pressure, is you're going to kill the things around the objective, and then you're going to move out a screen to make sure the opponent can't interact with you on the objective or bring something in deep strike or do some kind of charge from a rapid ingress, for example. And then if the opponent has some long range shooting that you just can't screen or stop, we then have Psychic Shield to try to stop that shooting as well. So we have the ability to hold objectives under pressure, but it does take a lot of practice. It takes a lot of good positioning, and it takes a lot of understanding of what your opponent is going to try to do to take that objective from you and making sure that you're stopping it. And that is a whole topic in and of itself, but I hope that kind of gets your mind thinking a little bit about getting past one of the difficulties that Aeldari has. And Seer Council has some unique tools that help us to actually be able to pull it off. We also want to be forcing our opponent into bad trades. And again, we're going to try to do this with some of the things specific to Seer Council. We're often going to be bringing Warlock Conclaves that give us -1 to wound. Forewarn give us -1 to wound, -1 to hit. Psychic Shield gives us 18-inch lone op. And so we have different ways of making it so that we can send a unit in to do something. And if our opponent tries to attack us back, we have different kinds of tools to try to make it a bad trade for our opponent. For example, if we have our Farseer Guardian brick that's kind of out in the open and the opponent goes to expose, if they don't expose enough, they may not kill it. And so we're going to be able to just absorb the damage with a -1 to wound, or if they don't get close enough, we're going to use Psychic Shield. And so we can just make it so that the opponent has a hard time interacting with some of our units and really getting good value into specific units. And this will force them into doing some bad trades, and that is always going to be better for you. Another aspect of forcing bad trades is using our speed and mobility. So Aeldari is known for its movement shenanigans or movement capabilities. We need to use that to the fullest extent and make sure that we are the ones determining the rules of engagement in effect. We're the ones sending our units forward to fight and attack, and we are the ones that are giving our units that we're allowing our opponent to actually interact with, whereas we're keeping our other units back and just not even letting them have a chance to do damage to them or interact with them. Our speed is really key here to being able to make sure we have the right distances and spacing to make that happen. An Unshrouded Truth can do a great job of picking up a unit and placing it exactly where you want it to be, so it's right at 12 inches away from the opponent, and you have a lot of other parts of the unit that are kind of trailing back, getting into cover and things like that. And so Unshrouded Truth also is part of this, where we can bring something in, shoot a unit, and make it difficult for the opponent to trade back. And lastly, Force Concentration. And I've kind of mentioned this before in some of my other videos. I really think Seer Council lends itself to this strategy. You really want to focus your damage on specific parts of the map. Generally speaking, it's going to be a flank, and it's often even going to be a weak flank of the opponent. And this is going to help us to create space to stop from getting screened out and allow us to set up more staging points and have better board presence to really cause our opponent major headaches and make things much more difficult for them. So make sure you are using our speed and using our combined damage of our units that can combo off of each other to do even more damage to the best of its effect, so that we can clear out a side of the board, hide behind some ruins. The opponent tries to hit back, they just can't quite reach us with most of their stuff, and then on the next turn we hit them again. And that's ideally kind of the overall tactics that you want to use to pull off a strategy to where the opponent just is not able to keep up with the damage we're doing. They just can't trade against us in the same way that we're hitting them, because we're using all of those elements that are unique to Aeldari, but also Seer Council, to make sure we're getting max damage and we're protecting our units from the hit back by using our stratagems. At the bottom here, I mentioned going first or second. That's obviously going to change a little bit about how the mid and late game go. And also, one thing I just want to highlight is knowing what secondaries you have left. If you've done a lot of your action secondaries already, then you know that you're probably going to be able to be very aggressive later in the game and still score secondaries. Whereas if you've gotten no secondaries that require you to do an action, then you may want to focus on keeping at least a unit or two capable of doing some actions that you're not concerned about their damage, like Warlock Skyrunners or Corsair Forward Reavers, for example. Their damage isn't that massive when it comes to our go turn, and so we want to make sure we have something to do some actions in the later part of the game if we haven't had to do our secondaries that are actions yet. So just kind of keep that in mind as the game goes forward. And then again, with the way challenge cards work, going first and second makes a big difference. And generally speaking, to kind of just keep this concise, if you go first, you're probably going to have to really pressure your opponent and make them play the game. You may have to take a little bit more risk. You may have to try to bait the opponent to really get them to come out and fight, but you got to force the game to happen, because if you just let the opponent sit back and you both keep scoring around the same, at the end of the game, they're going to score in a way that you couldn't, and they're just going to win. So you have to pressure them. On the flip side, if you're going second, use the fact that we're fast and that we can apply pressure even within the realms of safety and ruins to your advantage, to make it really hard for your opponent to actually force you to play the game and force you to expose. Make them take the risk and make them come out and try to make trades happen so that they are the ones taking the risk. And then that way you are just scoring and waiting for the right time, and they're going to be forced to basically make you play the game, just like we had talked about when you go first. And so if you can kind of sit back, make sure you're still staging and you're still applying board presence and having good board control, it's still important. But you don't want to necessarily be super aggressive if you go second, because you have the ability to just score better at the end of the game. So if you just keep that score about tied or maybe slightly ahead of your opponent or even just a few points behind, in all likelihood at the end of the game, you're going to end up winning because you're going to be able to score better than your opponent did because you score at the end of the turn as opposed to the beginning of the next turn. So I hope that kind of makes sense. I think most players kind of know that, but with Seer Council, it is definitely something to really pay attention to because we are a detachment that has a couple very specific kinds of play styles that tend to do well, and we need to be really paying attention to our secondaries and whether or not we need to be more aggressive or more focused on scoring. So I hope that all makes sense for you. So strategy, and I have a picture of a chessboard here because I like to kind of define strategy as an overall goal that would take multiple tactics to achieve. So a tactic in chess, for example, would be like forking a bishop and a knight with your pawn, or doing a discovered check, etc. A strategy would be like attacking the king side or attacking the queen side, or having a plan to castle your king on one side of the board. These are strategies that you're going to have to make multiple moves to accomplish, and that is how I kind of like to differentiate between strategies and tactics. With Seer Council specifically, our strategy is generally going to be to prepare a major attack and focus our firepower on the weak side of our opponent on a flank. And the reason is that most factions do not have the speed and capability of hitting us on the other side of the board well enough. It doesn't mean that you're going to completely stop your opponent from hitting you. They're probably going to be able to shoot you with some things. They may be able to charge you with a couple things. But ideally, we're going to be shot by and charged by as few units as possible while taking out a big portion of your opponent's army. For example, we might go in and take out 400 points of our opponent's army on one flank, and then on their turn, they just can't get a big block of their army into our units, and so they have to bring things out of deep strike. Maybe they rapid ingress something so they could at least hit us back some. Then we decide where we're going to attack next, and we apply our focus and our firepower in a specific part of the board again, possibly even on the other side of the board because we're just that fast. And again, make it difficult for the opponent to hit us back. And this is a combination of a lot of things we've already talked about. You may have to take out some of his units that are fast or have long range shooting so that we can stop them from hitting us back on the next turn. Now, of course, again, we have Psychic Shield to kind of help with that. We have Forewarned to help with the hit back. We have Isha's Fury to hit them as they kind of come back towards us. And so Seer Council has a lot of really good tools for pulling this strategy off and really just getting most of our army in one area of the board, focus it down, completely control it, and then as the opponent approaches, we're hitting them with Overwatch, Isha's Fury, we're stopping their shooting with Psychic Shield, etc. And so Seer Council is just a very good detachment that's able to do this strategy, I think, better than any other detachment for those reasons. Another strategy is flipping the board, and that's basically the idea of not necessarily just attacking your opponent from your deployment zone. And for example, if you were playing something like Tipping Point and you were, for example, if you're playing on a deployment where you're setting up on the long side of the board and you really feel better about getting your units and attacking from the short side of the board just because maybe the way the ruins are set up or just the way the layout of the board is, you can actually move quickly, focus down your opponent's army in that part of the board, and then kind of change the direction of the attack. Where instead of just attacking from long side to long side, you've went on one flank and now you are really attacking from the short side of the board. And we'll look at a quick example on TTS just to kind of really explain what that is, but I don't want to go into too much detail about that specific strategy because it's not one that's necessarily available on every layout, but it is a really interesting one that Aeldari in general can pull off, and Seer Council with our Uncharted Truth especially can pull off in a pretty neat way. Let me know in the comments if you've ever flipped the board and did it work out for you. I'd love to hear some of the stories. I've only done it a couple times myself because it really does depend on the layout and your opponent and everything. But when it's worked, it really can throw the opponent off and they're not really prepared to change, in a sense, the direction at which they're trying to attack. And so it kind of makes the game pretty interesting. Lastly, with strategy, we have to think about unit combination preparation. So again, in like chess, if we're attacking the king side, we got to get our bishops pointed towards the king side. We got to get our rooks over there. We need to get our knights over there. We got to move units to prepare them to attack. And with Seer Council, we kind of have to do the same thing. We need to get Lycus and the warp spiders staged correctly so that they can shoot and allow critical hits to be done with one of our other units. We need to have the fire dragons ready to go. We need to have the swooping hawks possibly in a ruin or somewhere where they are going to be able to move out and do some move blocking and apply their mortal wounds. And we need to make sure our Farseer is ready to get the +1 to hit, and Eldrad may be able to do +1 to wound. And we just want to make sure that our units are staged and prepared for the big attack. And that is something that you often have to do over the course of a turn and prepare for it. It's not something that you can just immediately do. So make sure when you're setting up, especially in turns 1 and 2, that you are putting your units in places to where they can combine their strength and really focus down the enemy on a specific part of the board. It all, again, kind of lends itself to that one idea that we're going to pick one side of the board. It's usually going to be the weak side of your opponent. Sometimes you can even take out the strong side of your opponent depending on how much they've exposed their units, or if they have something that's kind of vulnerable. Maybe you go ahead and just attack the strong side. But generally speaking, the strategy is going to be set up, attack the weak side, clear it out, and then basically attack from there depending on the situation. Like, you might go towards your opponent's home objective, you might go to the opposite side of the board and just control no man's land. There's all sorts of different situations. Obviously, this game is very complex, and the point is to be adaptable, but often that general strategy is going to help guide you on your decision-making process as well. For example, if there's a unit and you're just not quite sure what to do, just ask yourself, is it helping me with my strategy? Is that unit where it's at, or where I'm thinking about putting it, actually going to help me with the strategy that I have? And how would it do that? Well, maybe I need it over somewhere else to be able to apply damage with something else. Or maybe I need to move it somewhere so that in the next turn I can then do a move block or a screen for my army when I do my big attack. These are all things that we have to consider. And a lot of times, if you're struggling about what to do with a unit, you just need to make sure it's in line with your overall macro strategy. And that will often help you make your decisions faster, because you'll know if everything's in line, if everything is working towards that same goal. So I hope that makes sense. It's, again, these are big topics, and I'm trying to talk about Seer Council specifically and how to kind of think about Seer Council a little differently as a detachment compared to some of the Aeldari detachments. There's definitely a lot of crossover between these topics, and these topics are very big, they're very important, and you have to consider them regardless of the detachment you're playing every game. But I do hope that this is helping you kind of come up with ideas of how you are going to want to play Seer Council specifically, and with your list that you're playing, how that list is probably going to need to be able to perform to pull off these strategies. So I hope that all makes sense. Really trying to bring it all together here. Let me know in the comments if this was helpful, or if you felt it was a little overwhelming, or was too much information or too little information. I always love getting feedback. Definitely let me know in the comments. I greatly appreciate it. For detachment combos, we have some things that are pretty unique for Seer Council. But I want to start with an enhancement. In my opinion, the best enhancement that we have is the Torque of Moray Heg. The Lucid Eye is another enhancement that's pretty well and taken by a lot of players. But the Torque allows us to do some combinations and set up some plays that are just incredible, and it's often very impactful in most all of my games. Some of the things we can do, for example, is having this Torque on the Farseer that's part of the Farseer Guardian brick, for example. We can Unshrouded Truth the Farseer Guardian brick if we can't just move the Farseer into position, to apply her 12-inch aura to make it more difficult for our opponent to use their stratagems that are either defensive or in some cases even offensive. For example, if we're trying to charge in Jane's and the Howling Banshees into a unit, but they have something with Fights First nearby that could do a heroic intervention, if we move the Farseer Guardian brick within 12 inches of that unit, that would be heroically intervening. then we can stop that heroic intervention from happening if they don't have enough CP to do so. So basically, if they're down to 1 CP and they don't have a way to lessen the cost of it themselves. Another great one is to set up a trap for Overwatch. So we move the Farseer Guardian Brick in. If they want to Overwatch it, it's 2 CP, but then it allows us to bring other units in that they, again, can't Overwatch without it costing more CP. So maybe we keep our Fire Dragons safe, or Lycus and the Warp Spiders, and don't allow our opponent to Overwatch them because of the torque of Moria Heg. The cool thing about the torque as well is if they try to Overwatch and they don't have the CP to do so, then they're not allowed to use Overwatch anywhere else. And it's as if they had used the stratagem. So it's a pretty nice way to stop Overwatch in a lot of cases. But even in the worst case scenario, you're putting your opponent in a position where they either have to spend more CP for a stratagem than they would normally, and often cases it's doubling the cost. So you're affecting their CP economy by quite a bit. The other option is they just don't use that stratagem, and so it's kind of a win-win situation for you. Make sure if you're including the torque in your list that you're not forgetting about it. The first couple games that I played and had the torque, I completely forgot to announce it or use it. But the more I played with it and the more comfortable I got with remembering to let the opponent know that it would cost them an extra CP, then it was very impactful, and I was able to pull off some really neat combination plays because the torque was, in a sense, protecting my units from some of the defensive ploys of my opponent. And in other cases, it even allowed me to do extra damage because it stopped the opponent from doing some sort of armor of contempt or anything like that. So it was a great way to not allow the opponent to do all sorts of interesting things, like even in some cases a reactive move. The opponent may be thinking, well, I can reactive move this unit so I can leave it out in the open, and when they get close to shoot it, I'll just move it. But then we bring in the Farseer nearby or a Warlock, and with the torque, and they are possibly unable to pay to have that stratagem done. And so it's a really useful enhancement. Highly recommend it. And once you kind of get used to it, it can be extremely impactful in most of your games. And that kind of brings a nice segue into the Farseer Guardian Brick. I do think the Farseer Guardian Brick is a really unique and interesting combination that works really well with this detachment. And yes, you will see this brick in Guardian Battle Host, but it functions very differently. And to me, the reason it functions so differently is in Guardian Battle Host, the Farseer brick has to move on foot to get into position. And a lot of times that means that you're not quite getting the Warlocks in position to use their Destructors. You may not be able to get the full power of that unit into play. In Seer Council, being able to Unshrouded Truth the brick, it allows us to make sure that we're getting all of our models within 12 inches if we want, to make sure we're getting all that damage off. It also allows us to take a unit that is not exactly the fastest unit that we have, it's actually on the slower side, and put it across the board to still be impactful in any kind of fight that we do. And it really allows us to have, in essence, a Swiss Army knife unit in our list. This unit is good into most types of units as far as damage efficiency. It's not super efficient like Fire Dragons, for example, of course, but in general, it can do damage to basically any type of unit and do at least a respectable amount of damage. It also has good Overwatch. It allows us to use all the stratagems. Farseer Guardian Brick is great for using basically every stratagem. We can use it to make the opponent take battle shock tests to try to deny them some of their primary objective points. We can use it for Forewarned to try to make sure the brick stays alive if it gets charged, because it'll be -1 to hit and -1 to wound. And that way, if the opponent has Lance, it's still -1 to hit and -1 to wound. We're able to use Fate Inescapable with a brick to great effect because the Warlocks have AP 1, and so making sure their AP is actually being applied to units even when they're in cover is fantastic. All the Guardians AP 1 rifles, it helps out significantly. It helps the Bright Lance make sure it hits the heavy targets, and it helps the Farseer's Eldritch Storm with some AP 2 that sometimes can even hit AP3 with the critical wounds and do some pretty good damage into medium and heavy infantry. Obviously, Isha's Fury can be used as they approach this brick, and Psychic Shield can be used to keep the brick from being taken down from a unit that's across the board. So basically, you can kind of consider this unit as something you can always spend stratagems on, and it'll probably be useful and effective. Whether you're using it to move them to a different part of the board, to get a better angle to shoot, to protect them, to use them to bait an enemy. And when the enemy goes to shoot them, then they get a reactive move. They can do the fade back for free, and it doesn't cost one of our battle focus tokens. Makes it really hard for the opponent to make decisions, because if they shoot it, it can hide. It possibly has Psychic Shield, so they can't get a whole bunch of shooting into it in a lot of cases. If they try to charge it, then they have to try to not shoot it so it doesn't move away from the thing that's trying to charge it. And you can even put a Warlock with it to make it -2 inches to charge, which means that things that come out of Deep Strike are going to struggle much more into trying to charge it. You can obviously Overwatch with good results, and you can use Isha's Fury with good results to try to bring things down a little bit before they impact the unit. And so in general, this brick is just hard to interact with. It's hard to kill. It effectively uses all the stratagems in the detachment. And so basically, in a sense, the brick itself is just a good combination with the detachment. And by brick, I just want to, I guess, explain, I'm talking about taking a Farseer and having it attached to a Guardian Defender unit that has a Warlock Conclave attached. And even a 2-man Warlock Conclave is great because it gives -1 to wound to the whole unit, and the Destructors are still good, and they're going to be getting their +2 attacks and +2 strength, because each individual Warlock model should be within 6 inches of another Psyker model, because the other Warlock and then the Farseer will account for that. So it's a very useful brick, and that's kind of like the most basic version and one of the cheapest versions of that. Of course, you can add more Warlocks, you can add the Lone Warlock, you can add 2 more to the Conclave, and you can even add a support weapon if you really wanted to. I don't think the support weapon is as good in Seer Council as it is in Guardian Battle Host, so I don't generally recommend that you take like a D cannon or a vibro cannon with this brick in Seer Council specifically, but it's not necessarily the worst thing either. You can really make this brick do even more damage, and it's something that people have still done with good effect and still been able to win games. It doesn't mean that the list all of a sudden becomes bad because you added a support weapon. I just personally don't think it's the most competitive option that you can do with your points, and with how we're sitting, I think we need to use our points to the best that we can and most efficient that we can to make sure we're bringing in the best list if we want to be competitive with this detachment. Eldrad's another one of those that of course can be used in any detachment, but he has special combinations that Seer Council allows because of, again, Unshrouded Truth. He can get in position, make sure he can get his Doom off. He can be leading a brick and be useful in this detachment, and is basically an auto take because he is a Psyker. He gives us extra CP. Our stratagems are strong, so the extra CP is super helpful. And he allows us to do better with secondaries because we get that extra CP to where we can actually switch out our secondary cards to get one if we don't like one of the cards that we got. So Eldrad in general just synergizes so well with this detachment. I think some of the other detachments can use him, but he just doesn't have the really solid place that he does in Seer Council, in, say, Aspect Host, for example. And he fits in great with a couple Warlock Conclave, going in some Storm Guardians. He loves boosting the wound roll for the fusion guns and the flamers in the Storm Guardians. And on top of that, when he runs with some Warlock Conclave, he's boosting them as well. And of course, a lot of the units we're taking are going to be boosted to great effect by Eldrad. And so he's just a great combo piece that gets some extra options in this detachment, because in the other detachments, he can't just teleport across the map to apply Doom. And of course, you're probably not just applying Doom. When you do that, you're going to go ahead and shoot with the whole unit into a target. But that Doom can be so impactful in making sure that we hit hard and we actually destroy the units that we're trying to in that turn. So Eldrad, very impactful unit, great model, and combos really well with Seer Council. I want to talk specifically about Fate Inescapable just because I want to let people know the common ways to use it. Fate Inescapable is pretty much always just going to be good on the Guardian bricks that have Warlock Conclaves. The Warlock Conclaves make some of the best use of Fate Inescapable because their AP1 doesn't mean much if the target is in cover, but as soon as they have Fate Inescapable, now they're actually getting that armor penetration, which is putting things that have 2-up saves now on 3-up saves and 3-up saves on 4-up saves, etc. And every once in a while, you're going to get that critical wound that's going to boost it to an AP2. And so basically, you're going to be hitting with some Strength 7, AP1, and AP2 attacks with the Warlock Conclave. And so it's very strong, very powerful. If you have the target doomed with Eldrad, then they're going to be wounding basically everything in the game on 4s or better. And so it's just a really nice stratagem that complements the capabilities of our units really well. Because sometimes the struggle we would have is actually getting our damage to apply to the opponent when they have like 2-up saves, for example. And so Fate Inescapable works really well to make sure that our opponent is not saving as well, which can in some cases mean we're doubling or even tripling our damage with the stratagem. As far as combinations, again, it works with the Guardian Bricks and the Warlock Conclave especially. Pretty much every time you can feel pretty safe using it with that unit. It also can help the Swooping Hawks, but the Swooping Hawks often need even more help. And so if you're going to use this with Swooping Hawks, you're generally going to also want to hit the target with a Warwalker so that all the Swooping Hawks get that AP. Now this is especially useful because Swooping Hawks innately have lethal hits. So if they are getting their lethal hits in and the target they're shooting is going to be saving on 3s or 4s or worse in some cases. And so the Swooping Hawks can actually apply a lot of damage to most any target in the game because of those lethal hits. And again, when you combine it with Fate Inescapable and a Warwalker, it's going to create a really nice combination that's going to do good damage. Now, this isn't like the most important or most impactful way to use Fate Inescapable necessarily, but when you have 10 Swooping Hawks and they're all ignoring cover plus 1 AP on critical wounds, they're probably going to get 5 or 6 critical wounds in general, plus their lethal hits. And so you're often going to make your opponent take somewhere in the neighborhood of 10, 11 saves. That AP1 or the extra AP from the Warwalker can really make a big difference. And then when they go to AP2 because of the critical wounds, well, all of a sudden there's some serious damage that your opponent is going to take regardless of how good their saves are. And it just really makes it so that we can damage a target almost no matter what the stat line is, because it doesn't matter how tough it is when we have lethal hits. Doesn't matter how good the saves are when we ignore cover, and if we use something like a Warwalker to give us a little boost in our AP. And so this allows us to combine the elements of our army to really take down any kind of target. We can use the Farseer to boost our hit roll. We can use Eldrad to boost our wound roll. We can use Fate Inescapable to make it harder for our opponent to make their save roll. And so we have a way to affect every part of the roll situation when it comes to doing damage, which is just a really nice, again, kind of Swiss Army knife. It's a great stratagem that complements what we're already capable of doing with units that we're almost always taking, because we're often going to be taking Eldrad, and to less of an extent, we're going to be generally taking a Farseer. I know a lot of players don't take Farseers, but I think a lot of times you'll want to. And so we're going to be able to affect our rolls like this. And it's very nice to have the ability to do any one of those combinations, or even combine multiple elements of that, where we're going to +1 to hit, +1 to wound, ignoring cover, can all of a sudden allow us to do a substantial amount of damage. And lastly, common unit combinations. Now, obviously, I've already mentioned some of the unit combinations, but to kind of just rattle them off real quickly, because this is something that applies to a lot of the other detachments, really. But we're going to be using Lycus, and she can help the Swooping Hawks get lethal hits on 5-ups. She can help Fuegan get his sustained hits on 5-ups if he needs to shoot into heavy infantry, for example. We're going to be able to have Eldrad helping Warp Spiders. Makes a big difference with Warp Spiders to have Doom. Makes a big difference for your Fire Dragons to have Doom. And that Doom can often literally doom your opponent's unit when it's cast if you put the right type of unit into it. And so Eldrad is going to combine with most any unit you bring along. The Warwalker, like I mentioned, it does great with Warp Spiders. It does good with the Swooping Hawks as long as you have Fate Inescapable ready for them as well. And it does good with our Warlock Conclave and the Guardian Bricks in general. And so there's a nice little combination and synergy with the Warwalker with this detachment, generally speaking, just because of the units that we're often going to be taking in this detachment. And so those are some of the most common ones you're going to see. There is more, and of course the Farseer can +1 to hit can sometimes help with things like the Dark Reapers and just a lot of your army, like the Warwalker, for example. And so there's always miniature combinations of 1 or 2 units you can do to increase the damage here and there, but I think in general those are the most common ones. You may even see some people take Shroud Runners to give Ignores cover to more of the units in Seer Council, which isn't the worst idea, and I think totally makes sense if you want to try to help your Guardian Bricks by bringing some Shroud Runners as well. Seer Council does have a lot of different combination options when it comes to the units we bring for the detachment, but also how we decide to combine the strengths and abilities of those units to make sure we're doing a lot of damage into pretty much any target. So just wanted to kind of briefly talk about some of the common combinations you see, but they do overlap quite a bit with some of the other detachments in the Aeldari Codex. As a recap, we need to control the engagement. We have to use our mobility, and we have some unique movement that we can do with Unshrouded Truth, but we have to use our mobility to leverage our board control, our board presence, make sure that we're controlling it and allowing ourselves to score and trying to deny our opponents from scoring. So a lot of Seer Council is kind of area denial. We have Isha's Fury, so when they come into an area we're doing damage. We have generally good Overwatch options between Lycus and the Spiders and the Farseer Guardian Brick especially. We're going to be using fast units like Lycus and the Spiders, Janezar and the Banshees. We can Unshrouded Truth a unit. We use Swooping Hawks. So we're going to be using all this, all the mobility, the speed, and this kind of board control that we have to control the engagement, make sure that the fight is happening on our terms. And if we do that with Seer Council, which I think our detachment excels at, a lot of times we're going to have a good game. And so really make sure we're utilizing these strengths that we have, and I think you'll see some great results. And also, I think it's important to prioritize and focus. So prioritize keeping your units that are important safe, and then prioritize taking out your opponent's units that are efficient into your army so that when they hit back, they can't hit back quite as hard. And we're going to focus our attacks so that we create a safety zone by cleansing the enemy out of that area. We're just going to kill everything that they have in a specific part of the board so our units can actually be safe in the next turn, at least safer, and make it hard for the opponent to interact with them using our stratagems. Make sure you are using our speed and focus to take down big threats when it makes sense, when it's possible. And we have the combination of units and damage capability with our detachment and using Unshrouded Truth to make sure the right unit gets to the right place so that we can basically make sure this happens. And of course, this is a dice game, so nothing is assured, but we can be as sure as possible by placing our units in the right positions to make it happen. We need to do all this while again protecting those high damage units like Lycus, Fuegan, Janezar, the Guardian Bricks, with some of our scouting and skirmish units so that our opponent can't trade well into us, and when we hit them hard, and when they hit us back, they're just not doing as much damage as they would like. So if you follow kind of these general rules of thumb, take into account everything else that was talked about in the video, I think you'll really do well with Seer Council. Seer Council is not an easy detachment to play. It takes a lot of practice, a lot of games. I do hope, though, that these videos that I've been putting out are beneficial and help you a lot on your journey to becoming a good Seer Council player and also just a good Aeldari player. Because once you learn this detachment, I think you can play any of the detachments and make it easier to learn them, because few of the detachments have as many tricks and things to consider when you're playing as does Seer Council. So thanks again for watching, and if you made it to the end, I really appreciate it. Let me know if you're interested in coaching. Send me a notice, and you can do that by emailing me. There's a link in the description, but also nightguysgaming.com. You can go to the website, put your name and email. I'll send you something back, and we can talk about coaching and see if it's the right thing for you. I am planning on putting together some videos that go into some of these topics in detail. I'm not sure exactly if they're going to be, 3 or 4 hour long videos on specific topics. I'm still kind of going through what I think will help people the most and trying to figure that out. So if you have ideas, let me know in the comments. Also, it'd greatly help me out if you'd like, subscribe, and hit the bell. We're quickly approaching 1,000 subscribers, and that's super exciting. I never thought that this little video project that I started doing would do anything like this, and so I really appreciate all the support, the feedback, and everybody commenting on the videos and letting me know their thoughts. It's been a great experience, and the community's been great. I'm really looking forward to putting out a Discord server, so that is going to be coming soon, because I'm going to start doing monthly calls where I would like to have the supporters and members that have questions do a monthly call. And I was going to be doing that actually this past week, but I wasn't able to get the Discord server made, and I wasn't really able to announce it early enough. But basically, everybody supporting at the aspect host or higher. I do want to kind of keep it focused on competitive ideas and questions, and also kind of make it kind of a mini coaching session, just answer general questions about the meta and especially Aeldari as a whole, with people that are really interested and focused on pushing Aeldari to the higher limits. And so that is all some things that are going to be coming out soon. So make sure, if that interests you, that you have the bell hit and you're subscribed so you know when these videos and more information comes out. So check out the Patreon if you want to get more information on some of those things. I am going to be trying to continue to build information and some special things for those that are supporting on Patreon, because I greatly appreciate it. I want to make sure I have just some things in there that are just thank yous for the people that are supporting in that way. If any of that interests you, check that out, and I look forward to talking to you guys in the next video. Thanks again for watching and listening.